So, Lix, it could be the first time you heard that, or this could be like the 1,000th time. I hope it still kind of gives you chill bumps to hear the parable of the, what's it called again? Parable of the prodigal son. Right. I thought y'all were probably going to say that. We've heard it, most of us, 1,000 times since we were Sunday school kids, and we know it so well. The challenge really is to hear it again with fresh ears. And one of the challenges with it is that we know it so well that we even have these catchy titles for it, like the parable of the prodigal son. But did you ever hear Jesus say, let me tell you the story of a prodigal son? Not at all, right? Usually whenever we hear parables, Jesus does this amazing thing where he says, the kingdom of heaven is like this, or let me tell you a story that's related to the context about which we are discussing. And then he'll say something like, a man had 2 sons, or the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner, that whatever, right? And usually it's the first thing out of his mouth after he has set up the let me tell you this thing that tells us what he's really trying to tell us, right? So what's the first thing out of Jesus' mouth? A man had 2 sons. It's not about the sons so much as it is about the father. We'll get there in a minute. Because my guess is part of the reason you get your chill bumps whenever you hear this, if you've heard it for the 1,000th time, or maybe if you've heard it for the first time today, is because really quickly you recognize something about yourself in the story. Now, it could be that you recognize yourself as one of the children of this father. It could be that you recognize somebody else in your life as one of these folks, but we start to see these patterns in our life that start to match up with it. I want to tell you a little bit about my story. Some of you have heard some of this before. I won't share too much about it again, so I hope I won't bore those of you who've heard this before. But I want to share with you a little bit about the story so you can kind of see the way that we find ourselves. Now, most of the time, whenever folks are telling you a little bit about their story, most of us have become accustomed to doing this thing where we don't really listen. Instead, we're just thinking about our own story, and we're kind of thinking about what we want to say next. I will give you permission to do that right now. One, because please don't carry any extra embarrassing bits from my story into your life and tell other people about my story. But 2, because the really important thing is that you hear yourself in this, not that you know my story. But this is a bit of my story. Many of you know that I was baptized when I was 17. I've been that kind of kid who was filled with teen angst. I was the moody kid who would prefer to go read Friedrich Nietzsche on my lunch break instead of hang out with the cool kids. I loved to antagonize Christians. They were usually just easy to antagonize, and I just got, glee out of it all. And I was also in a pretty dark place at some point. I, somewhere in there, though, was called to experience the grace of a church life. I got called in to a church on a Sunday night service. I went in. I felt so loved and started to awaken to some new thing in my spiritual life, or that I had a spiritual life to begin with. So I was baptized. I did that thing that people do. I really said, Jesus, here's my life. Take it. And so went off to college, and many of you knowing me the way you know me will know this is weird. I was like the vice president of a Baptist student union, and as well as like the Episcopal group, and I was rhythm guitar in a contemporary worship band, and I got involved in like church planning, and Jesus, here, take me, take all my stuff. We're gonna do this thing. It was a blast. It was also exhausting. I, at some point, though, and this is the point of this story, at some point, for all that living that I had done that was, I thought, godly and a way of showing my faith, I started running away at some point, too. I had thought that I was going to go on to seminary and become a priest, maybe. Somewhere in there, I took the notion of grace and began to squander it. We've got a couple kids here, so I won't tell you too many of the details. I'll just say dissolute living doesn't even cover it. I woke up one day, having dropped out of college now a couple times. I had gone to work in restaurants and was trying to work my way up through the restaurant chain. I'd really kind of dropped out of school seriously at least twice on this path. It was going to end up being 3 times shortly after this part of the story. If you don't know this, restaurants are often like the modern day equivalent to pirate ships. So I was like the first mate on a pirate ship. Lots of drinking, lots of other stuff, plenty of broken relationships that I had. And I woke up like the prodigal son, so to speak, suddenly coming to myself and realizing I can't believe how far I am from the picture of who I thought I was going to be. Not in school anymore. Casey, who I had just fallen in love with, Casey was going to graduate from school not long after that and move back to Atlanta, and I was probably going to lose out on that relationship too. I didn't understand anything about the decisions I was making anymore with regard to drugs and alcohol, apart from the fact that I was probably trying to anesthetize some pain within myself and not confront it. I was a disaster of a human being. Still am in other ways, just different ways now. I was a disaster. And so I rehearsed a speech. I was going to go to the priest at the Episcopal Center at the University of Georgia, where I was going to have to reapply to get back into school one day. And I was going to tell him about my life and tell him what I had run away from, or what I thought I was running away from, and what I thought I might try to run back toward. And that was this notion that maybe I could be a high school history teacher because I was a history major, and the priest thing, I am clearly disqualified for that. So does that sound right? Can I be a high school teacher? And when I went to him, he had this lovely way of saying, Remington, you don't know yourself anymore. And what's important for you is for you to go home and listen to the people who do know you and hear what they have to say to you. So I went back to Jessup, Georgia, of all places. I prepared yet another speech, expecting to go into this church and have to say, all right, here are all the things that I've done, the places that I've been, the terrible mistakes that I've made. Here's my long laundry list of sins and the reasons I am no longer qualified to be a priest. What do you think? And instead, what happened when I got there was truly, no kidding, all of the little old ladies in church that had loved me like grandparents, they were there. And they all kind of, seriously, all of them, and there were only 6 of them. It's a small church. They all kind of turned to me and we knew you would come back. And they wrapped their arms around me. I'm going to end up crying. They wrapped their arms around me and told me how much they loved me. And one of them said, we always knew that you would come back because you're going to be a priest one day, and we've been waiting on you to come home. They would sign the paperwork and send me off to seminary. And I would go. The moment that they wrapped their arms around me to tell me that they loved me and that they had always known who I was and who I would be was the most definitive and life-changing moment, apart from the birth of my own children, that I have perhaps ever experienced. I had been a prodigal son, making a full return all the way back to home, and not even getting the chance to confess the whole sins of my journey, not even getting to finish my speech like the son who tries really hard to say, I've sinned before God and before you, and I've done all these things, and before he even gets to say, please take me on as a hired hand, his father says, my son, go get the fatted calf and the robe and the ring and the sandals and put them on him. He is alive. None of the other story even matters anymore. I've been that son. I've been the recipient of that kind of grace. I bet you have too. And for many of you, I hope that you weren't listening to me tell my story because you were thinking about your story. It's more important that you know your version of that story. For some of you, you may say, I don't have that story. I never did the squandering and dissolute living thing. I never took that long arc away from home where I had to come back. Now, here's the beautiful thing. If this is a story primarily about people like me who wasted a part of their life in dissolute living, then you've been left out of that story, haven't you? But this isn't a story about me or about the rest of us who have that prodigal thing in us. This is a story about a prodigal father. So if you look, Jesus is very careful to say, the other son, the one that was kind of perfect and had everything going for him all the time, who worked really hard and always followed the rules, at the moment that the other son comes home, what does he do? He literally walks out. His journey doesn't take him far, but his journey still takes him out because he can't possibly understand the power or even the mechanism of the grace and love that was in his Father's heart. I've been there too. I bet some of you have been there too. The power of parables often is that we can find ourselves in multiple characters, and if not one, we can find one other character that fits us. If you've not been either one of those characters, by the way, you might also be the fatted calf. I was the fatted calf in seminary, just minding my own business, truly. And the next thing you know, they're like, hey, you need to be led to slaughter over here for the sake of other people, and you're going to owe us $60,000 at the end of this ride, by the way. That's how that went. Parables work that way. We can be anybody. But parables are so often so much more than who we are. So if you notice that for the son who wandered far away, what the father does is leave to go find him, to meet him on the path home, to restore him into relationship, not only with the father, but with everybody else back home too. And when the older son begins to go out and say, I can't be a part of this anymore, what does the father do? He goes out. He leaves the party behind and puts his arm around his older son and says, you're my son and I am always with you. We're always going to be together. And everything that I have is yours already. By the end of this parable, every single one of us falls into a category that is a recipient of grace. Our stories are so different. The story that brought you here today is so different from the person sitting next to you. Maybe you are the long-lost child. Maybe you're the one who's been in church every Sunday for your whole life and has never broken a rule. Maybe you thought you were coming to a party today to receive some, fatted calf. It's just stale bread, but it'll do. Maybe you are one who has just started off on your journey away. And maybe this is the one last ditch attempt to see whether or not this love is worth it. Maybe there is someone in your life that you truly believe couldn't possibly be welcomed back. There are so many different possibilities for who we might be. The point of the gospel, the point of the good news of God in Christ, the way in which it is so perfectly summarized in chapter 15 of Luke, is that regardless of what your story is, God's story is always the same. God is a God who will leave to come find you. God is a God who will always wrap God's loving arms around you, maybe even in the person of another friend from church, another family member, a sweet little old church lady. God will find a way to put an arm around you and tell you that you are God's beloved child, that God is always with you no matter what. That everything God has that truly matters is already yours. And that your story is not over until you are home, safe and sound. Amen.